This is a game that really wants to be a cross between Dark Souls and Shadow of the Colossus. It wants to be a gauntlet of boss fights with a really high difficulty curve. And in a lot of ways, it is just that. On paper, it looks like an absolutely kick-ass game. But in execution, well, there's a few things that are a bit lacking. Now, I'm not saying this is a terrible game, because it can be quite fun, and I find myself wanting to take down every boss. But the thing is, there's just something about this game that makes me lose interest very quickly. You see, conceptually, this game works very well, and it's pretty much exactly what it bills itself as. The movement controls and evasion mechanics are tight and well designed, giving the player character a lot of movement capabilities, and trust me, you really need this mobility because many of the bosses are hyper aggressive in the way that they attack. Seriously, with some of these bosses, you will have little to no time where you can stop actively avoiding their attacks without dying. This makes some of the fights very hectic and challenging. But the real interesting part comes from the player character's attack. So the PC has a bow and a single arrow that can be shot. In order to shoot the arrow, you have to charge up the shot, and the arrow can be recalled back to the PC by holding down the fire button again. However, given how the bosses attack rapidly, and the arrow takes several seconds to come back to you, if you miss the boss's weak point on your first shot, the fight's probably over because it's gonna be pretty hard to retrieve that arrow. This challenging attack mechanic means that even if you are able to easily locate a boss's weak point, you have to time your shot precisely in order to actually hit. This makes fights very complex and interesting, but to be honest, a lot of these fights don't really feel like boss fights because they're over very quickly. You see, the player character dies in one hit. If they get hit by the boss, they're dead. However, the boss also dies in one hit if you hit their weak point. But a lot of times the weak point is kind of hard to find or hit. Either you hit the shot or the boss gets you. Either way, the fight's probably gonna be over in under 30 seconds. In most other games, boss fights are a drawn-out struggle where tensions build as the boss's health bar slowly drops, and the player character is hoping the whole time that they don't mess up. And Titan Souls doesn't really feel like that at all. It doesn't have that same kind of tension. The fights feel more like puzzles that you're trying to solve than monsters you're trying to slay. And while I do find that to be a fun concept, it's also where the game starts to fall apart a little bit. Every time you die, you get sent to a spawn point some distance away from the boss's lair who you were just fighting. As I said, in most fights you either win or lose very quickly, and you're probably gonna lose a lot, so you're gonna be making that walk back from the spawn point a lot. The thing is that the walk really isn't that far usually, probably like 30 seconds or less, and in another game where you'll be fighting the boss for a while, this walk doesn't seem so long since you spent so much time fighting the boss. But this isn't that other game. In a game where a boss attempt lasts a few seconds, all that time spent walking ends up being almost more, or even a lot more, than the time you spent actually fighting the boss. And when it takes you 10 tries to kill that boss, that little walk really starts to piss you off, because you're making it so frequently. Also, there's one point in the game where there's a spawn point on an elevator, and if you die and get sent back to that spawn point, it triggers the elevator, forcing you to wait for it to go back up and then come back down in order for you to leave the elevator, which is absolutely infuriating. Seriously, that seems like a really big oversight, and it takes up so much damn time, turning that little walk into a minute plus. And I think that at the root of it, that's a really big part of why this game loses my interest so quickly. I'll go up against some hyper-aggressive boss like this stupid Yeti, and die within 10 seconds of activating the boss. Then I gotta walk all the way back up there again, only to then die again after a few seconds. I mean, look, I'm not saying the game should be easier. In fact, I quite like games that have a high difficulty curve, but when you spend more time running back to the boss and going through loading screens and death animations instead of actually fighting it, it starts to feel like they're just padding the game time by not spawning you outside of the boss's lair. And that's another thing. This game is pretty damn short. Normally I'm fine with short games, but the only thing that seems to provide any longevity to the game is being bad at it. If you one-shot all the bosses, this game takes like less than half an hour. Seriously, it's been Their speedruns are like under 15 minutes. I get that the game's trying to be minimal on purpose, but this just goes straight up beyond that. For example, you can look at the lack of story. Unlike, say, Shadow of the Colossus, that this game's trying to be similar to, where there's a clear, definite story, in Titan Souls, nothing is explained or even really implied at all. You don't know where you are, why these monsters are here, or what your purpose really is. All you know is that you're killing these titans in order to absorb their souls. Maybe you're absorbing their power. Something else? I don't know. And it's never really stated. And that's pretty much it. This game is a cool concept, and I do find the fights themselves to be enjoyable little puzzles, but the overall game surrounding these puzzles is kind of lacking. If they cut down on backtracking and maybe explained what the hell was going on, then maybe this game would be a bit more enjoyable. Because at the end of the day, I love these little fights. I like them. It's not a traditional boss fight, but it's a really fun little challenge to overcome, and I really love this concept. It's just, all this stuff around it is just, it's not good, and I think it's trying too hard to be indie on purpose. You know, only having like 2 buttons that actually control and do anything, not having any dialogue, not having any story. I think it's trying really hard to be an indie game. Much like how this game wants to be Dark Souls plus Shadow of the Colossus, at the same time, I want to like this game, but I just can't because of the current state that it's in.